Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. This episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by DK Eyewitness Travel Guides. These colorful guidebooks are filled with great information and are one of my favorite guidebooks. I have 20 of them here on my bookshelf. Learn more at dk.com. This episode is also sponsored by Trippy.com. Trippy.com is a leading travel community and a great place for you to get answers to your travel questions or to answer to the travel questions for other people or connect with fellow travelers. Check that out at trippy.com.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 446. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about museums, botanical gardens, outdoor cafes, and kangaroos on the lawn as we go to Canberra, Australia.
I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. We'll hear more from both of our sponsors later on, but first, let's hear about Canberra, Australia. I'd like to welcome to the show Tennille from hungryplanetblog.com, who's come to talk to us about Canberra in Australia. Tennille, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
And when we say Canberra, to many people it may come as a surprise that Sydney is not the capital of Australia.
I was going to touch on that, actually. Yes, a lot of people out there think it is Sydney. I had a friend who actually grew up in Lesotho in Africa, and their school textbooks actually said that Sydney was the capital of Australia. So it is commonly mistaken, but it's definitely Canberra.
Well, to be fair, I don't know about a lot of Australians, but a lot of Americans couldn't find Lesotho on a map, so
Yeah.
it does go both ways.
Yeah.
So you've come to talk to us about Canberra, which I think most people when visiting Australia don't get to. They get to
Absolutely.
Sydney quite often, Cairns, maybe Brisbane or Melbourne, but don't get to Canberra. Why should we go to Canberra, Australia?
Yeah, I do think a lot of people do pass us over, which is a shame. It is the capital of Australia, so it's got a lot of unique things going for it. So Canberra itself, it's a low-rise planned city. So the city area itself doesn't actually have any skyscrapers in it. and it was designed actually by a Chicago architect called Walter Burley Griffin and his wife Marion in the early 1900s. So they won a competition with their design for Canberra, and their design had Canberra set around a big man-made lake called Lake Burley Griffin, and it has corridors of bushland extending right down into the city. So it was really quite unique. It's very much a bushland setting, which is unusual for a capital city. Really, from anywhere in Canberra, you can drive 15 minutes in any direction and you end up in the Australian bush. So it's really unique in that way. And it's only a young city. It's 100 years old. We just had our centenary. And it's a very progressive city. So there's been a lot of change in the last 10 years, a lot more culture and entertainment. I really think Canberra's really finding its identity, and I don't think a lot of people realise how fantastic it is now. It has actually suffered a bad reputation, particularly with people comparing it to Sydney and Melbourne. They like to say that Canberra's dull and boring, but it's changed so much that I want people to know that it's a fantastic place to come, especially for tourists. And it's the perfect city for tourists, being planned. It's very easy to navigate. It's well laid out. It's very safe, and it's got a very low crime rate. So perfect for tourists to come to.
And when you say it's a planned city and only 100 years old, so we should say, first of all, that the capital of Australia is not in Canberra because it was, at the time, the most important city. In fact, it's there because it wasn't.
Exactly. They built it. It was purpose-built. So...
And so why didn't they pick a different city? Give us a little bit of that history.
Sydney and Melbourne, they couldn't pick, and I don't know if there was a dispute or I don't know the full history of it, but they couldn't pick one or the other to be the capital. So they decided to scout out a site just for Canberra to be the capital. So it ended up in its own territory, which is called the Australian Capital Territory. And it was pretty much just farmland and bushland, and then they built the city from the Walter Burley Griffin's design, so it's all purpose-built.
And the Capital Territory is surrounded by New South Wales.
It is, yes.
I say that as if I knew that before we started talking 5 minutes ago, but I know that now.
You do.
Excellent. And what would you recommend for an itinerary if one was going to come see Canberra?
I would plan an itinerary for Canberra that would include some weekdays and a weekend. The weekdays are really good time for seeing more traditional tourist sites, museums and art galleries, and that way you're avoiding the domestic tourists that come to Canberra to see those things on the weekends. And then you can spend your weekends doing things more like the locals do, so eating and drinking and socialising. There's fantastic bushwalking and sports and markets and things like that. So I would plan it over something like a Wednesday to Sunday. And most people, I think, would be coming from Sydney if they're coming to Canberra, because most of their international flights would come into Sydney. I'd actually recommend driving from Sydney to Canberra. It's only about 2.5 hours and it's all on highways. So it's very easy driving. And the flight, you can fly it. It's about a 45-minute flight, but it's awfully expensive. You're probably talking $120 to $250 for a 45-minute flight. So it's really not worth it. So take the drive along the highway. Your drive to Canberra will take you by Goulburn, which is actually my hometown. It's about 45 minutes out of Canberra itself. And you should pull in off the highway into Goulburn to see the Big Merino, which is a very, very large concrete sheep. Which sounds completely crazy, but it's a part of Australia's really weird obsession with what we call the big things. And I don't know if you've heard of these, but they're dotted all over. You haven't? Okay. So they're dotted all over Australia. You've got the big merino and Goulburn. You've got the big prawn, the big banana, the big pineapple, the big lobster. It's completely bizarre. And they're all things that are representative of industry in the area. So Goulburn...
Okay. I live near the giant artichoke in Castroville, so I
I'm
understand
sure it's
this.
along those lines. So people actually do road trips to pop in at these things and take pictures of themselves in front of them. And I did once see on TV some Swedish tourists doing just that, but they were taking pictures of themselves in front of all of Australia's big things, and they were completely naked. So it's a bit of a thing to tour around and see those things, and you'll get to see one. And I personally think, and I'm probably biased because I'm from Goulburn, but the big merino is the best big thing in Australia. It's the most impressive.
And,
So
and a
stop
merino,
in to see that.
pardon the ignorant question, is a type of sheep?
It's a sheep, yes.
Okay.
And the locals have named it Rambo. That's his nickname. So
Let's take a break here to hear about the first of our two sponsors, and that is DK Eyewitness Travel Guides. As I mentioned, I approached them to be a sponsor on the show because they happen to be one of my favorite guidebook series. They're very colorful guidebooks, lots of illustrations, lots of useful information. I happen to have the guidebook for Australia, and so I checked to see what it had about Canberra. It has lots of good information, and it has two-page spreads on Canberra, one on the Parliament House that has a diagram of that, and one on the Parliament Triangle, a map of the larger area. Those are in addition to a map of the Capital Territory, as well as a map of the War Memorial and also of the National Gallery of Australia. Each of those are surrounded by smaller pictures and small articles that give me an idea what I will see in the Capital District or what I will see in that particular museum, which makes them particularly useful for a visual learner and photographer like me. And so that's the kind of information that I enjoy about the DK Eyewitness Travel Guides. Learn more at dk.com.
So from Goulburn, you'll take the federal highway past Lake George, which is a lot of the times of year is actually a dry lake. Obviously, Australia is a dry country, so the water dries up in summer and sometimes even in winter, but it's really pretty. It's sort of nestled in amongst some hills. And when the water isn't there, you'll have kangaroos grazing out there on the lake, and sometimes you'll have farm animals and cows grazing. So that's really nice. And there's a big wind farm built along the back of that now, which was a bit controversial when it went in, but I think it's quite pretty. So that'll take you into Canberra.
And one assumes we're driving through sheep country, since there's a great big concrete sheep.
Definitely sheep country.
Okay. Sheep and
it's not
kangaroo
really wet enough for cattle country. Like the dairy cows are further towards the coast. So definitely sheep country.
Well, and then more of the cattle stations are further north up in Queensland.
Oh, the big ones. Yeah, they're in the outback. Yeah. Once in Canberra, for weekday itineraries, I'd be doing your big tourist sites. There is many of them in Canberra, so I won't go through them all. These are all the sort of things you're going to find in a good guidebook. So I'm going to touch on my favourite spots. So I'd start at the Australian War Memorial, which is an absolutely brilliant attraction. It's
and this is for World War One.
All the wars, actually.
All the wars, okay.
Yeah. And it's a beautiful building, sort of Art Deco style. It's nestled at the bottom of Mount Ainslie, which is quite close to the city area. It's got this big wide boulevard leading up to it. And when you look one way, you've got the War Memorial. And when you look the other way, you've got across the lake. And they're perfectly lined up because when you have a planned city, these things happen. You've got old Parliament House, and then right behind that, you've got new Parliament House, and they all line up along this big boulevard. So the War Memorial itself has really nice reflection ponds and the list of names you can put poppies on and all that type of thing you'd expect. But it's also got an amazing interactive museum, which is really well done. The main hall where they've got the G for George Lancaster bomber, which is quite a well-known bomber because it did 96 combat missions in World War II, and it brought home every crewman who flew on it alive. So they've got that set up in the main hall, and they do sound and light shows around it, which are just fantastic. And one of the more recent shows they put on was a video sort of presentation that was done by Peter Jackson, who did Lord of the Rings. So of a very, very high standard. And anyone who ever goes there raves about it. So I definitely recommend doing that.
And when you say poppies, this is something that I was less familiar with. So red poppies with brown centers.
Yes.
As in Flanders Field, the poppies grow is where
exactly,
we're getting it from.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's traditional that if you've got a family member's name on the wall, you'll take a poppy along, and there's sort of little gaps in the wall next to the name, and you can pop the poppies in the slots there. So it's like a remembrance. The poppies are for remembrance.
Excellent.
And I'd also recommend, of course, doing some of the galleries. So we've got the National Gallery of Australia, which is Australia's largest art gallery. And I should mention, pretty much everything I'm telling you here, all these attractions are free. Okay. So if you're on a budget, they're fantastic. The National Gallery really covers a fairly wide range of art styles and it has a lot of touring exhibitions. So you might want to see what's on whilst you're there. The touring exhibitions, you often have to buy a ticket for online and get a time slot to turn up because they're extremely popular.
Sure.
So they've had in the past things like the Impressionists and Rembrandt and that type of thing come along. So that's well worthwhile. And right nearby there, you've also got the National Portrait Gallery. So as the name suggests, it's all portraits and they're of prominent Australians. And then you've got their stories on plaques that go along with it. So it's quite good for reading a little bit of history. And there's a lot of people in there, certainly I've never even heard of. It's not just, say, politicians or people that you'll know. So there's some really interesting little stories there. And there's a really amazing painting there, which is the most recent portrait of the Queen that was done by an Australian, and it's just stunning. You've also got near the lake there the National Museum of Australia. It's all about interpreting our social history.
Okay.
So it's quite a light-hearted museum. It'd be suitable for the kids. The displays are quite varied. And it's really about things that have made or what makes Australia iconic. So that's nice. And there's a nice cafe in most of these galleries, actually.
And what sort of things make Australia iconic and therefore are featured in the museum?
I haven't been for a little while. I do remember some of the original cars being there, and I'm not going to name what models because I'll get it wrong. And they've probably got fun little things like the Hills Hoist clothesline. I don't know if you know about Hills Hoist clothesline.
Not a clue.
Australians are really weirdly proud of their Hills Hoist clothesline. So they're like and everyone had one of these when they were growing up. I know we did. It's like a rotary clothesline that has a crank handle. Okay. And it goes up and down. And when we were kids, and everyone has broken one of these when they were kids, you would swing it around on it. So I don't know why Australians are obsessed with their clotheslines, but just funny little things like that. And then stories and parts of our history that really stand out. So it's quite good. There's also the Botanic Gardens. So that's really just about having a wander through the native flora. So you can just head in there. Again, there's a nice coffee shop and you can just leisurely wander around, and it's all native Australian plants. And they've also got a large population of Gippsland water dragons. So it's in like a rockery setting with water, and the water dragons do that thing where they sit really still and you don't even see them. And then you walk by and you think, what's that? And then you realise there's dozens of water dragons all sitting there. So, and they're quite big, so they're really impressive.
When you say quite big and you say the word dragon, I'm probably getting the wrong size. So how big are we talking about?
A very large lizard.
Okay.
So maybe, I don't know,
like the size of an iguana? 30
Probably not that big.
Oh, okay, no.
No,
not that big.
Maybe a smaller. Yeah, okay, now I'm thinking about it.
So 30
maybe
centimeters would be roughly 3 adult hand widths.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And they vary. You'll have small ones and quite large ones, so big family groups there.
Okay.
So that's worth doing.
This seems like a good time to stop and talk about our second sponsor, which is Trippy.com. Trippy.com is an online travel community for getting your questions answered about destinations you may be thinking about going to or answering other people's questions. One of the core values of Trippy is experience over possessions. As they say, we live by saying, take only pictures, leave only footprints. We would rather have a passport full of stamps than a house full of stuff. One of the ways that you can support Trippy.com, that is supporting this show, is to go over there and answer this week's Amateur Traveler Question of the Week. And the question for this week is, what is the best capital city that you have ever been to? And why was it the best? Was it the food? Was it the music? Was it just the most beautiful capital that you've been to? I'll read some of the good answers to that question on next week's show and the answers to last week's questions later on in this episode. To get to this week's question, go to amateurtraveler.com/trippy2. That's trippy with a Y.
There's also an interesting trip you can do in the car through the suburbs that have the embassies in them, which may sound completely boring, but Canberra has themed embassies. So all the buildings are in styles that are particular to the country that they're an embassy for. So the US embassy is a beautiful Georgian building, and I read that it's in like a southern style.
Okay.
And it sits up on a hill. They're heavily guarded. They're all gated houses, but it's like taking a little bit of a mini world tour when you drive around them.
So what are you say the U.S. one, a Georgian style, the Japanese one, a Japanese architectural style? I mean, what little Taj Mahal for India? I mean, how themed are we talking here?
Some of them are better than others.
Okay.
The Chinese one has the traditional sort of pagoda style roof.
Okay.
So they vary quite a bit. Some have gone heavily themed and some have just got sort of touches of an architectural style that you would recognize. So
the three that you would say we really ought to see are?
Definitely the US Embassy is worth seeing.
Okay.
But there is honestly so many. And you can actually get a list of those embassies on the Visit Canberra website.
Okay.
So you can print a little list and visitcanberra.com.au and just have a drive around. And they're all very close together. So you can pretty much see them all in, probably half an hour. The suburbs are Yarralumla, Deakin and O'Malley, but they're all right near each other. So you can just
and when we
take
talk
your
about
drive.
Canberra, we haven't talked about its scale yet. And my understanding is its size is relatively large, but its population isn't so big.
Yeah. I couldn't tell you how many kilometres or anything it is, but we're talking of a population of about 350,000 or 380,000.
Okay.
Fairly low density.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, in the city, there's no skyscrapers. You've got some apartment buildings, but yeah, fairly low density sort of housing. On one of those weekdays, you also might want to head into Lake Burley Griffin, which is right in the city. So you can walk there probably from a hotel you're staying in. And there's a walking track around the lake. So you can walk around, you can hire a bike to ride around, you can hire paddle boats to take out on the lake. There's a company now set up to do Segway tours, those standing vehicle things. So you can do a Segway tour around the lake. And the lake itself is really a centre for activity. A lot of local events are held here. Like there's a big tulip festival around the lake in September. There's a big fireworks show called Skyfire in March. They do a big Canberra Day concert in March. So it's sort of a real hub of activity, and all the locals head down there on the weekends and go walking around the lake for exercise, and it's really pretty.
And Burley Griffin after the architect who designed the city.
Exactly. Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Yep.
Walter Burley Griffin. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Did not get that at first. Okay.
And you'll also want to head up to one of the viewing points so you can see the city area in itself and really get a perspective on how the bush really comes right into the city. So there's a couple of places you can do that from. There's a very big hill you can go up that's in the Arboretum, and you'll definitely need a car to do that. You can't really walk there from the city. You could walk up Mount Ainslie, which is behind the War Memorial, and you could actually walk there from the city. And there's a walking trail that goes to the top to the lookout. And there's also Black Mountain Tower. You have to pay to go up Black Mountain Tower, though, but I think it's only about $7.50. And you head up there, and they've all got great views. So you can see the lake, you can see... Well, I say you can see the city, but it's so low rise, it really is sort of just nestled in the bush. So it's quite an interesting perspective to see a big city nestled in bushland.
I see. Okay.
And there's a couple of things I'd recommend for families as well. If you've got kids, there's an interactive science museum called Questacon. I haven't been there since I was a kid, but it was heaps of fun. They have a big lightning generator that shoots bolts of lightning around the room, and it's all very hands-on.
Those are great fun.
That one. Yeah. So all that type of thing, and the kids can really let loose in there. And there's the National Zoo and Aquarium. So that's a really fantastic zoo, and they do some really good interactive programs. So I've done the Zoo Venture there, which is a program, runs for maybe 2 hours, and you actually go around with a zookeeper and you get to feed all the animals. So it is through the cages, like what they will smear honey on your hand and you hold it up to the bear cage and the bear licks the honey off your hand. And that's more exciting for Australians because we don't have bears in Australia we do in America and Canada. And you'll feed the tigers through the cage with some tongs, and it's all very getting up close and personal. And they have the Walk on the Wild Side tour, which is a full day where you get to be a zookeeper for the day. So they're not cheap programs, but they are very well done.
Excellent. And so this is all for what we're doing during the week.
Exactly. And I'd say that's probably most of what I would recommend during the week. There are other things. Do check your guidebook before you come. A lot of it's really niche interest stuff, though. So it depends what you're into. Like, personally, I'm not really into the mint. And there's a National Film and Sound Archive and a lot of national this and national that
Sure.
because we're the capital. It's going to depend on what you're really into. So they're the ones that they really are my favourites.
And you mentioned check the guidebooks. Are there things that the guidebooks are going to tell me to that you're going to tell me, yeah, you've been to that, we should just skip it?
Nothing specific that I think is a total waste of time.
Okay.
Depending what your interests are again.
Sure, right.
If you find plants completely boring, don't go to the Botanic Gardens. Or if you're not into art, the art gallery is going to be a waste of time. So just because there are so many attractions here, I think it's about planning out the ones that interest you and leaving out the ones that you find
Sure.
a bit dull, because you're not going to have time to see it all, because depending how long you're coming for, there is a lot of things here.
Okay. And I'm sort of assuming that people are fitting this into a larger trip to Australia. So
Exactly. You would be pretty crazy to come all the way to Australia and just see Canberra. So I think you'd be pretty crazy to come to Australia and just see any one destination. It's well worth driving around or flying between a few spots. So Canberra would be maybe 5 days within a bigger trip.
well, and you've mentioned driving quite a few times, and I would have to say for the people who are from North America or from outside of English influenced areas who drive on the right, don't get too put off by driving on the left. It takes a little getting used to, but it certainly can be done. I have done it, and you just have to remember as you're making those turns at the intersections which one to turn into.
I have never attempted driving in America, so
Yeah, there's at least one Australian couple I think that is still a little traumatized by a turn that I made right at them, but you get used to
Yeah.
it pretty quickly.
Yeah, and you know what? Canberra is designed for drivers, and it is the way I'd recommend getting around, because you've got to remember it was a city that was planned in the time of the car.
Right.
So it was designed for that. The roads are big and wide. There really is barely a peak hour. You know, our population's low enough that peak hour is barely an hour, and that is it. The rest of the time, there's very little traffic on the road. There's lots of signposts. And if you've got a GPS, you're not going to have a problem driving. And that's what I'd recommend. There is a bus network here, but it's average.
Okay.
And I don't like being limited by when the buses are going and the schedules. So I definitely recommend getting a car for when you're here.
Okay, and it's also a little more spread out than being a ideal walking city, is my impression.
It is. Yeah, a lot of it is within walking distance, but there are certainly things that aren't. There used to be a tourist bus here called the Explorer bus, which possibly could still be here. But I just think grab a car. As I said, the roads are so wide and the driving's pretty easy. So just give it a go.
Okay. And then on the weekends, we're going to be hanging out with the locals.
Yep.
You mentioned sport and music and other cultural activities. What are your recommendations?
Okay, so Canberra really has a growing cafe culture, which I love. And there's a funny little story behind Canberra's cafe culture. And it started in the 60s with a guy called Augustin Petersilke. And he was from Vienna. And he wanted to bring the continental practice of outdoor eating to Canberra, to his cafe. But unfortunately, it was considered unhygienic back then to eat outside. So he mounted an epic battle.
Unhygienic. Okay.
Yeah, who knows?
Okay.
He mounted an epic battle against council and the bureaucrats, and he even at one point petitioned the Queen to allow him to set up tables on the street in the city. And in 1968, he did succeed, and he was allowed to put out tables for his customers out on the street. So that cafe called Gus's is actually still there, and it's the original outdoor eating venue in Canberra. And since then, outdoor eating and the cafe culture seems to be a bit of an obsession with Canberrans. So the first year I moved to Canberra must have been about 10 years ago. It was the middle of winter that I was moving here, and it was probably 6 degrees, windy, slightly rainy, cloudy, and there were people eating outside with no heaters, and I thought, what is going on here? And I was coming from a country town where there was no outdoor eating, so I thought it was pretty weird. But that's what the Canberrans do. They love to eat outside.
Now, of course, 6 degrees centigrade or Celsius is still a lot better than some of the people who are listening to this are seeing on the in the Midwest or the East Coast of U.S. or in other places in the world. So it doesn't sound like it gets all that cold in the winter comparatively.
No, yeah. So winter.
So I'm guessing the summer is a little warmer.
Yeah, we have far more extreme weather than Sydney, so
Okay.
do come prepared for that. Sydney being
On the water.
coastal is a lot milder. Our winters would be a winter average winter morning would be about -3, but it certainly could go as
Okay.
low as
So just below
-8.
freezing. Okay.
Yeah, and about -8 would be the coldest day you would get on a winter morning, and
Okay.
then the average daytime temperatures would be anywhere between say 6 and 12. But then the summers are really hot, so
And when would you recommend coming then?
it depends what you're coming for. Like summer is festival season, so there's lots of things to do
Okay.
and see, but it's just really hot, so you have to come prepared. It's not even summer yet, and we had a 39-degree day the other day.
Oh, that's hot. Okay.
Yeah, so if you're coming for festivals, which we'll talk a little bit more about at some point.
And just to put it in perspective, body temperature in Celsius is about roughly 39.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, 38, I think. So, yeah, you're going to need water and hats and sunscreen. And the sun is harsh with I guess it's the hole in the ozone, but you will get burnt. And I
right.
certainly
Yeah.
still get burnt, even though I'm used to it. I can go out. I just went out on that 39-degree day and we wandered around markets and did some things, and I came home completely roasted. So you've got to be really careful. And I'd say,
So
especially if you're
sunscreen
coming
and
from
a hat.
England. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if you're coming for wildlife, spring or autumn would be better, because on the really hot days, all the kangaroos that are normally out grazing all hide under the trees until the sun goes down because it's just too hot. So it really depends what you're coming for. Spring is beautiful though, so if you want a happy medium, September, October, November, that type of thing might be the way to go.
Okay. Although you mentioned festivals in the summer, so we've got to get back to that. What sort of festivals would we find if we brave the heat and come in summer?
There's all sorts of things, and some are yearly events and some are just one-off type of events.
Sure.
So my favourite by far is the Multicultural Festival, and that happens I think it's early March, and the whole city area basically the roads get blocked off and it gets shut down for about 3 days, a Friday, Saturday and a Sunday. And it's all about multicultural food. So hundreds of food stalls set up in little tents, and they are all cooking their own cuisine from their country they're from. And they have big stages set up. So they're doing local dance and song performances from their local countries. And it's really fantastic. We actually now, because I live about 25 minutes from the city, we actually get a hotel room in the city now. So at least for one night. So we have a base to go back to, because the festival goes till midnight, all day until midnight for sort of 3 days in a row. And the hotel room's good to have as well, because if it's really hot, you can escape the heat for the middle of the afternoon. Last year it was about 39 degrees on the Saturday of the Multicultural Festival, but down in the tents with all the cookers and the burners going, it was just stifling, and it's extremely crowded. So it was good to have somewhere to go and have a drink of water and just relax and then go back out again, because it is very, very hot.
Okay.
And as far as other festivals go, it's well worth checking what's going to be on when you're here, because there's lots of things that are just sort of almost like pop up, totally random. We stumbled across something just the other day called the Forage Festival, which was set up in an airport hangar near the airport. And it was another sort of food festival, and also like vintage clothes and music and that type of thing. So we didn't even know it was going on, but apparently it happens 4 times a year. So lots of things like that sort of happen all the time, but mainly from November till March is sort of the season where that sort of stuff's going to happen. It's just too cold in winter to even bother.
Excellent.
So there's a few different suburbs you can do this in if you want to sort of experience Canberra's cafe culture. There's Kingston and the new development called the Kingston Foreshore, which has waterfront dining. That's fairly upmarket though, so I don't go there too often. It's a bit pricey. There's Manuka, which is right near Kingston. It's got some historic buildings, which I say historic, but Canberra's only 100 years old, so they're probably from the 20s, and that's got some really nice eateries and things. My favourite area is called Dixon, and it's like a little Chinatown. So it's all Asian food, Thai, Vietnamese, noodles, that type of thing. It's not so much outdoor eating, but just fantastic Asian food. I would recommend, though, starting out, say, a weekend in Canberra in a suburb called New Acton, which is right next to the city. It's a new area of town that's just sort of popped up, and it's got some really modern buildings with crazy angles and rusted metal and just really funky and modern. And on the weekends it's really peaceful, and there's very little traffic in the area. There's lots of public artworks and big old trees to sit under. And there's some really lovely little cafes in there. There's one in particular we tried recently called A Baker,
Okay.
and it's just doing really funky food, almost you might even call it a little bit experimental, surprisingly reasonably priced. You get a big breakfast for under $20. And the building itself's really cool. The shop that was in there before the cafe that's there now was a wood-fired pizza place that burnt down. When they refitted it, they left the burnt walls and everything. So it's just like these strange burnt walls and exposed piping, and it's just very funky. So I'd give that a go. And it's got a big outdoor area as well. And they actually do breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and they have a bar. So it's open all the time. And they do, sort of afternoon music sessions out in the courtyard. So it's a really lovely spot. And once you've tried that, I would head over to a suburb called Braddon. Braddon's on the other side of the city to New Acton. You could walk to all of these suburbs though, really. And Braddon is an sort of semi-industrial suburb that had car yards and mechanics and things like that. But like in a lot of cities, as the apartment buildings go up and more people come in, those suburbs start changing, and it's suddenly become this really funky part of town. So there's pop-up shops and bars and coffee roasters, and it's just a really lovely spot now. It's totally changed. And I recommend they're trying out a place called the Bent Spoke Brewing Company, which is a new microbrewery there. And now I'm not really into beer, so I couldn't tell you much about the beer, but it's got all the big vats behind the bar and bench-style tables, and you can have lunch and drinks, and it's pretty cool. And once you've done that, you might want to try out the Lonsdale Traders, which is an old mechanics workshop that has been set up full of pop-up shops. So they're sort of selling quirky things that you wouldn't find in a mall or anywhere else. A bit of handmade stuff, unusual design, knickknacks and things. So definitely give that a go. And I believe there's very soon a new development coming there as well, more pop-up shops and mixing those with food trucks. So food trucks are fairly new to Canberra, but they're suddenly sort of popping up everywhere. So I believe they're going to be bringing to Braddon the Spit Shack, which is a food truck that that sounds disgusting, doesn't it? Now they say
that's as in cook on a spit.
Yeah. And they do lamb and pork, and they serve it on these just massive rolls with gravy and mint sauce and all that type of thing. So
with some beetroot thrown on there just for good measure.
I've heard that Americans don't eat beetroot the way that
not
Australians
so
eat beetroot.
No, the first time I had that on my hamburger, it was quite a surprise.
I wouldn't have it on a roll full of roast meat, but I would have it on a hamburger. It's the best. So, the food trucks there are sort of popping up as well, which is really cool. And when you're in Braddon, you're literally across the road from the city itself. You walk across one set of traffic lights and you're in the city. And I think the city is the area that's changed the most in the last 10 years and is what will really surprise people who haven't been here for a while. It used to be kind of dull. It had a fairly generic mall there and a kind of a seedy nightclub, and there really wasn't much there, but it's been completely revitalised. The shopping centre is probably 3 times the size it was, and very modern now. Still sort of the standard shopping you'll get in a mall as opposed to what you'll get across the road in Braddon. But underneath the mall, all these beautiful restaurants with outdoor eating have opened up. So they've got big gas heaters so you can have outdoor eating year round, which obviously the Canberrans love. So it's a really great spot just to go for dinner and drinks and just to chill out.
Excellent. And I assume that somewhere down in the center of the town, there's also a Capitol building?
No.
No.
We don't do Capitol buildings.
Seriously?
Yeah, I'm not even sure what that is.
So it's the capital of the country, but there's no one building that's sort of the center of the government?
Parliament House.
Parliament House. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So Parliament House is next to the lake, but we definitely don't call them Capitol buildings.
Okay.
Yeah, so you've got old Parliament House and new Parliament House, but the current Parliament House is obviously where Parliament sits, and all the politicians fly in for that. So, yeah, and in that city area as well, there's a couple of places I'd recommend. There's a Tongue and Groove, Honky Tonks, and Playground, which all sound very fun, don't they? But they're all great spots just to have dinner and drinks and that type of thing.
3 different places.
Yes.
Because otherwise that's a really long name. Okay.
Yeah, 3 different places that I'd give a go. They're probably getting borderline expensive, though, so it depends on your budget. There are certainly cheaper places to eat. And for me, Canberra is all about multicultural food. I just think the multicultural food here is just brilliant. And you've got Vietnamese street food, Malaysian street food, Chinese dumplings, all that type of thing in the city as well. And they're much cheaper than those sort of trendy bars. So it depends what you're into.
Well, and Australia's getting a reputation for being a little more expensive. So here in 2014, when we're recording this, can we say inexpensive, you're putting roughly in what dollar range, and expensive in what dollar range?
I'd say if I went to one of the Vietnamese or noodle places,
sure.
I would pay for beef noodle soup or a plate of noodles, something like $15 at one of those places.
15 Australian dollars.
Australian dollars. Okay. If I went to something like Tongue and Groove and had a plate of sliders or trendy burgers or something cool like that, you're probably getting close to $30. Okay. But then if you went to the nicer restaurants again, in sort of the next level above, you might pay $60 to $80 for a meal. So it really just depends. There is something for every budget. Those sort of middle of the range ones are probably $30 to $40. By the time you buy drinks, and you're probably up for a couple and some drinks and a meal, $120, that type of thing.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to me, that does sound, especially once I calculate that that's Australian dollars, that sounds a little more expensive than we would pay. So,
exactly. And definitely I know when I've eaten in America, I'm always like, oh my God, this is so cheap. So our food is certainly more expensive. There's no tipping though, which helps, and there's no tax being added on. So the price you see on the menu is the price. Unlike in America. So you'll know that with $15 for noodles, it is $15 for noodles. You don't have to tip anyone. So that's a little bit different.
Okay, good to know. Anything else you would recommend for the weekend? You mentioned sport, but we haven't covered what the most popular sport is in Canberra. I know what it is in Melbourne, for instance, that's more known for its sport.
Yes. I'm not a big sport lover. There are cricket games that come to Canberra, and there's a sort of historic oval that the cricket games come to near Manuka. There is rugby league, which is like the opposite of the AFL. You either like AFL or you like rugby league, one or the other. You generally don't watch both. So the big game around here is rugby league, and the local team is called the Canberra Raiders.
And AFL, just to make sure that I have correctly, that's Australian rules football?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So rugby league is the game around here, but I can't tell you, I haven't been to a match since I was a child, and I used to go with my dad. So, but there's a lot of outdoor activities here that people generally do on the weekends as well. So what we would call bushwalking and you would call hiking is really popular, and you can actually do bushwalking almost right in the city because of the nature reserves, how they come down to the city. And we certainly used to live at the base of Mount Majura, which was a 10-minute drive to the city, even in peak hour traffic, and in the afternoons we go bushwalking. So you can do that in the city, or you can head out to Namadgi National Park, and that's the national park that borders the south side of Canberra. It's very close though. From the city, you're probably talking a 45-minute drive, and it's free to go into. So that's unlike New South Wales parks, which you actually have to pay to go into. So you can head out to Namadgi, and they've got anything from short walks that might take an hour or two. You could do full day walks, and then you can do multi-day walks. So, and there is camping spots as well. I believe you should book your camping spots, some of them in advance, and keep in mind also that most of the Australian summer you'll have total fire bans. So it may not be camping like you're used to in America. You're not necessarily going to be able to have a campfire. Right, sure. Because of obviously the danger of bushfires. So
I live in California where things catch fire all the time in the summertime.
Exactly,
so I
and it's
understand
just
that.
like that.
Because we don't have rain for months at a time.
Yeah, just like that.
Although
So
we don't have trees that tend to explode with fire like you do, but
yeah, the eucalypts are
actually,
a
it's
bit
not quite true. We
dangerous.
actually have a lot of eucalyptus trees. It's just they're imported. So
Yes, yeah. It's funny when you go around the world how many eucalyptus trees you see, and you think, oh, that's very Australian. I've done a lot of the shorter walks out at Namadgi, but if you're really into hiking, there's some longer ones, and the big one you can do is actually 650 kilometres, and it'll take you from Canberra into Victoria. So it's very remote, though. It's quite different. I've read a little bit about like the Pacific Crest Trail and some of
right, sure.
those American trails, which you sort of come out in towns quite often. This is totally remote, and you've got to arrange your food drops. You've actually got to go hide your food in the bush, basically, before you go, or otherwise you won't have anywhere to get food. So
we've actually done an episode on the Pacific Crest Trail if people want to hear about that, and trail angels and all of that, and how you get your water and such. But
yes.
yeah.
So this is a little bit different, and it's certainly not something I'm going to be running out and doing. But for something unique, you're in Australia's high country here, and I know Australia's high country is not particularly impressive on world standards, but you will go through the snowy mountains. You've got Mount Kosciuszko, our highest peak out there, which is, to put it in perspective, it's about half the height of Mount Whitney. So it's not super impressive, but that's Australian mountains for you. But it's really pretty out there. Like even in just Namadgi, if you're going for a day walk, you're in the undisturbed Australian bush and you'll see kangaroos grazing, like hundreds of kangaroos grazing. You might see wombats, but they're pretty elusive. You'll see wombat poop. You may not see the wombat. And they poop in towers. That's how you recognise it. They'll go find a rock. They poop on the rock, and then they poop on top of the poop. It's completely bizarre. And I've seen echidnas. Yeah, I know. I've seen echidnas out there. You'll definitely see lizards, things like blue tongue lizards, which are native. And you might mistake the lizard for a snake at first and run the other way. You might see snakes, but generally they're lizards. So don't go running too far.
Okay.
And lots and lots of native birds. So if you're into bird watching, the Australian native birds are just stunning. Things like cockatoos, galahs, gangangs, rosellas, kookaburras, all those type of things. So they're everywhere. And you won't miss the cockatoos. They make a hell of a racket. That's what we call bushwalking. There's a fair few other outdoor pursuits people do in Canberra. Mountain bike riding is another really big one. And that's mainly done in the state forests. So state forests are completely different to national parks. They're planted to be logged. But in the meantime, while we're waiting to log them, you can go mountain bike riding in them. That's extremely popular, and they have a lot of races, like there's 24-hour races and things like that they do there. And other things out at Namadgi or various places, abseiling, rock climbing, all that type of thing. Canberrans are known to be very active. And also out that way near Namadgi, you might want to pop in at the Tidbinbilla tracking station. That is one of 3 NASA tracking stations worldwide.
Radio telescope.
Yeah, exactly. So I believe you've got one there in California, and then the other one is in Spain. And then we've got one in Canberra. So there's a space museum there. It's not of a super high standard, but it's worth a wander around. There's a nice little cafe, and it's in the bush. So you can see some big satellite dishes out in the bush, which is unique. And yeah, I think that pretty much covers what you're going to do on the weekend. It's all about the cafe scene and the outdoor pursuits for me.
Excellent. Well, I think that's close to winding us down here. Before I get to my last 3 or 4 questions, anything else we should know before we come to Canberra?
I think people should definitely check what's going to be on while they're here.
And you mentioned the Canberra site being the best place to do it.
Yeah, and I think there's also a site called What's On in Canberra.
Okay.
That's another good one, which gets updated with the things that are changing, because we've a lot of touring exhibitions. Like the population's sort of not big enough to sustain things to be here on a permanent basis, but they'll come and go. So we might have a Cirque du Soleil show here for a month.
Sure.
They're pop-up tent type things, or we'll have one of the big art shows coming by for a month. So check the websites before you come so you know what's going to be on. And also keep your eye out, because like I said, we stumbled across that food festival on the weekend. We had no idea was going on, and it was absolutely fantastic. So keep your eye out and see what the locals are doing that weekend. And of course, be prepared for the weather. If you're going to Sydney, or a lot of people just assume Australia is going to be hot. And most of Australia is hot. And sometimes I question why I live in the cold part of Australia in winter. So certainly if you're coming in winter, be prepared. But also, actually, when I say that about winter, the winter days are still stunning. Like, we'll have blue skies, beautiful clear days, very little rain. It's just cold. So you can completely prepare for that clothes-wise. Even in spring, or sometimes even in summer, though, although the days can be very hot, the nights can then cool off. So just come prepared with your layers and things. It's not like Sydney, which Sydney will stay 20 degrees overnight. We'll never do that. It'll be back down to a lot of the times
more arid.
6, overnight. So, just be prepared for that.
Excellent. Last questions. So you weren't born in Canberra, but moved there. How did you know when you were really a real Canberran?
So I did grow up just down the road, and Canberra was our certainly nearest town, like city that we would go shopping in and entertainment, that type of thing. But I was amazed when I moved here, and I would have thought living in the country you would have more wildlife and things like that. But I really knew I was in Canberra when we moved to an inner city suburb where we had possums pounding on our roof at night. They'd dive out of the trees and thunder across the roof and wake you up. We'd get woken at 6 a.m. by screeching cockatoos and laughing kookaburras. And then in the winter, we would have kangaroos living on our front lawn. So
On the front lawn?
Literally on the front lawn. So we lived in a suburb called Hackett. It's at the bottom of Mount Majura, but it's an inner city suburb. And kangaroos in winter would come down from the mountains looking for more grass, and they would come onto the lawn, and sometimes we'd have a little family group or a mother with the joey in a pouch, but every single winter you could guarantee we had this big old male kangaroo. And I think they're a bit like elephants, where the old males leave the family group, and so he'd come down every winter and he'd live on our lawn for days and days and days at a time. I'd open the front door in the morning and he'd be right there at the doorstep. I'd nearly have a heart attack. And then I'd go to work and come home 8 hours later and he's still sitting there, just eating, hanging out. So that's extremely strange. I can almost guarantee you're not going to get that in any other city in Australia. And the funny thing is, you're not going to get that in country towns, because I grew up in a country town and that never happened. So that's one really unique thing. And you're in Canberra when that's all happening.
And I'm sorry. Yes, that does sound unique. You've got me at a loss for words here. And I normally say one thing that makes you laugh and say only in Canberra. We may have answered that question as well. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Excellent. Well, last question. If you had to summarize Canberra in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Bushland, blue skies, and progressive.
Excellent. And where can people read more about your travels and about food too, since you write about travel and food?
I do. I am at hungryplanetblog.com, and you'll also find me on Facebook at facebook.com/hungryplanetblog.
Well, Tennille, thanks so much for coming on The Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for your hometown of Canberra.
That's okay. Thanks for having me.
One update on a news story, and that's the news story from last week that Venice was banning roller suitcases. They have either backpedaled on that or clarified that, oh, no, we only intended that to be for vendors' carts. So no problem, take your roller suitcase to Venice. I heard from Simon this week, who wrote this letter. Thanks for providing such a useful and entertaining podcast. I've been listening for many years and downloaded loads of the early ones and got tips from many places. I wanted to write about some experiences I've had in relation to a couple of the podcasts. I had planned a California vacation with, amongst other stops, a stop in Lassen Volcanic National Park. I was holding off listening to the podcast on the park until close to my departure to help plan my time there. I had listened to the ones on San Francisco and other planned stops. However, a few days before I was due to fly from the UK to San Francisco, I had a heart attack. I am much better now, but long-haul flights are out of the question for the moment, so I was thinking of a possible short-haul flight when the episode on Luxembourg was broadcast. Not a place I had thought of, but the enthusiasm of your guest motivated me to book a trip, and I did that for the weekend and really enjoyed this underrated city. The fascinating casements and the contrast contrast between the old city and the new. I got a Christmas market for good measure. Many thanks for such a timely episode. Maybe one day I'll get to listen and listen to the podcast, but thanks for the work you do and the enthusiasm of your guests. Regards, Simon. Simon, thanks so much for your letter and certainly our best wishes for a speedy recovery. I hope you'll be taking long-haul flights again soon, and let me know if you're in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that goes out to the rest of you, as I live in San Jose. I also mentioned that I would be sharing with you the results of the question from last week on Trippy.com on the best hidden beaches. One is you're just going to have to go. There were some really good suggestions, and that's going to be amateurtraveler.com/Trippy1. But the top answer that people voted, and the beach that was named most often, was the southern tip of the Osa Peninsula in Costa Rica. As Ross from Fort Collins said, it looked like no one had ever been there, just the noise of howler monkeys and scarlet macaws. He posted a picture. Those are my footprints and the only ones we saw. It looked like dinosaurs were going to jump out of the jungle at any moment. The Osa is the only real part of Costa Rica left. Heidi from New York had a great picture of the skeleton coast of Namibia, a windswept expanse of nothingness. And Sherry from San Francisco had a beach in Okinawa, Kaiji Beach, which is one of the few beaches with star sand. And if you don't know what that is, you're going to have to look it up like I did. So again, check out the answers from last week's question at Trippy.com. With that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, feel free to send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, post a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. Don't forget to support our sponsors, DK.com and Trippy.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I